Hi everybody, welcome back. In the last video we introduced inflation, the third of our big three ideas in macroeconomics. We introduced inflation and we started to introduce the idea of an index. And so if you haven't seen that, you can pause this video and take a look at that. But the primary index that's used in calculating inflation is the consumer price index. So in this video, we're going to look at what that is, what's included, how it's computed, and how we use the CPI in order to compute inflation rates. And then at the end, we'll do a little example. All right, so consumer price index. This is a measure of inflation. A measure of inflation that is calculated based on the price level from a fixed basket of goods and services that represents the average consumer's purchases. That represents the average consumer's purchases. Okay, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics does surveying to understand the average consumer's purchases in an economy. It creates relative weights. And then depending on how the prices are increasing in each of these categories, they do a weighted average in order to calculate the final inflation rate in the economy. So here's an example of some of the weights that would be used in a consumer price index category, where housing makes up the most of the average consumer's spending, and then we have transportation, food and beverage, medical care, and so on and so forth. So one thing I want you to just kind of do is think about, because this CPI is calculated in aggregate, and it's an economy-wide average, think about how these spending category weights might be different for someone in college versus someone who's retired, or perhaps you yourself. How would these weights change for you? And so depending on how each of these prices change over time, your kind of personal inflation rate would change as well. And if you recall, in the very first video, we saw for a lot of these categories, the inflation rates since 1970. And so, for example, if you're spending a lot on medical care or housing in that time period, the inflation rate was especially high in these categories. Okay, so anyway, think about that. And we're going to now talk about how the CPI is computed. So first of all, remember, this is a basket of goods and services purchased by the average consumer. So the first thing we need to do is fix the basket. If you want to think about this on a very kind of individual level, think about when you go into the grocery store, you could pick up one of those little shopping baskets and you fix the basket. So let's fix it with a gallon of milk, a carton of eggs, some carrots, and some tortilla chips. And that's the basket that you're looking at. You want to calculate the inflation rate for that bundle of goods. So in this case, for the whole economy, that basket of goods includes everything up in a chart like this. And depending on consumer behavior, this is going to be updated from time to time. So you fix the basket, and after that, you find the prices. And compute the cost of the basket. And once you have the cost, and you do this over several periods, and so in the case of the grocery store, you go every single month and you buy the gallon of milk, carton of eggs, carrots, and tortilla chips, and you just find the cost of that basket every single month, or every single quarter, or every single year for an extended period of time. And by doing that, you're collecting data which you can then use to compute a consumer price index. And so to do that, you use the following formula. The consumer price index is equal to the cost of the basket in a current year divided by the cost of the basket in a base year. Remember, indices always have a base year. So cost of the basket in a current year or any given year divided by the cost of the basket in the base year, that's going to give you the index number. And actually, go ahead and, if you want that to be a number around 100, you can multiply that by 100 instead of being a fraction. And then with the CPI, you collect that over several time periods, and then you can calculate the inflation rate. And the inflation rate is simply going to be the percent change in the CPI from one period to the other. So if we're looking at an annual inflation rate, you're going to calculate this as follows. Inflation rate is equal to the CPI in the current year over the CPI in the base year. And if you want to look at it annually, you could do CPI in year T in time period T over CPI in time period T minus 1. And that'll give you a monthly or an annual inflation rate. But in general, whatever year you're interested in, think of that as the current. Always divide it by the base year, and that's going to give you the inflation rate. Again, that's going to be, you have to subtract 1 in order to be a percent change. So this will give you the inflation rate, and it'll be a decimal point. Again, if you want it to be a whole number percentage, you can just multiply it by 1, which we're going to do an example to give you a little bit of practice with that. So here we have American CPI back to the 1940s, and I've collected some of the data here, summarized it in these numbers. I'm going to do a few of these examples and leave the last one for you to try yourself. But we're going to look at total inflation and then the average inflation per year. And we're going to just use that same formula that we used, that we just wrote down. So if the CPI in 1984 is 100, and the CPI in the year 2000 is 172, what's the inflation rate between those time periods? To do that, we'll look at the CPI in the year 2000 divided by the CPI in the base year, which is 1984, minus 1. And so that's going to be 172 over 100 minus 1 for 1.72 minus 1, which is 0.72 or 72%. So the total inflation over that entire time period is 72%. So prices rose by 72% between 1984 and 2000. To get the average inflation per year, we can just subtract 2000 from 1984 in order to understand that this was 16 years, and we can just take the average, so 72% over the entire time period divided by 16 years is an inflation rate of 4.5% per year. and that's the annual inflation rate. Similar for the next couple, so 1984 to 2018. CPI in 2018 is 251, again divided by 100. 251 over 100 minus 1 is equal to 2.51 minus 1, 1.51, or 151% is the answer for total inflation in that time period, 1984 to 2018. That's 34 years. So 151% over 34 years is equal to 4.44%. And I'll just do one more example, just so that you have a little bit more practice, and then I'll leave the last one. I'll show you the answers, but I'll leave the last one for you to try. So from 2000 to 2010, in 2010, the CPI was 218. In 2000, it was 172. Minus 1 is equal to 1.267 for 26.7% over those 10 years. And again, if we want to just see over those 10 years, we take 26.7% divided by 10 for 2.67% per year. And then finally, the last one is there for you to try, but I will give you the numbers. If you want, go ahead and pause the video and do it first. But in the end, you should have the total inflation, 15.14%, and the average inflation per year is 1.89%. Okay, so double check your numbers on that. And once you do, you should be all set. That's going to be it for this video. As you can see in the next, we're going to talk about the overstatement of inflation, where the CPI is commonly thought to actually overstate the true rise in the cost of living. So that'll be in the next video. I will see you then. Thanks.